Anyone who plays the classical guitar was likely drawn to it by its unique sound. As we develop our playing, we rightly devote much time and thought to developing a beautiful tone, along with all the colours that the guitar is capable of. And this might take us in all kinds of directions. There's the tone production itself, the special strokes, some gliding strokes, combinations of gliding strokes with vibrato, the different colours. But there's another aspect of tone production that I think is also crucial for developing a beautiful sound, and that's how we balance the sounds within a texture. In other words, voicing. Now, in developing a sense of voicing on the guitar, I think it's helpful to develop a vocabulary, a range of tools, a choice of tools that you can apply to a given situation. And I think it's quite helpful to know what are some useful studies and exercises you can work on to develop them. I'll show you a few ideas that I share with my students. And I want to start with the basics, which I think is simply learning how to balance chords. On your screen is one of Brouwer's simple studies, number 2, entitled Chorale. Although this piece is quite easy to play, it's one of those wonderful pieces of music that seems to expand with your abilities. And I'd like to take you through how your thinking might evolve as you work on it. Now, this title, chorale, implies that there are at least 3 singers, that the top 3 voices in the chords should have a singing quality. Now, that's something we can simply test for. Let's say we're playing the first chord. We want to check each note for its singing quality. What we do is we play the chord and then damp everything except for one note, and then check that note for its fullness. So if I damp everything but the D, that's nice and full. Now I'll leave the A ringing. Not bad, but not as strong as the D. And then now the B is ringing reasonably well, but it seems as though the D is doing better than the other notes, and perhaps the weakest one is the A. So if I try and just give a little bit more to the fingers and a little less to the thumb, and check the A, we're probably not going to get it perfect, but that's, I think, a big improvement on the original voicing. And now I've woken my fingers and ears up, I can attempt to play through a line of this piece with approximately equal balanced voices. So far so good. Just to play through this entire study, realizing its full dynamic range, but keeping the voices equal, is a big achievement and something worth practicing very regularly. But there are other possibilities. First of all, it's possible to imagine the choir sound itself playing around with different voices, different voicings. For example, one can imagine a solo singer on top, and maybe the inner voices, the other singers, are humming underneath that gently. Now I'm still being very careful about the voicing of the lower notes, but I'm going to use more pressure on the second string to see if I can make it sing out above the others. Try again. Now the piece grows towards the third phrase where Brouwer marks forte. So I could keep on going with the top voice being more than the others, but perhaps at that point I'll equalize the voices so that the whole guitar starts to work with all of its energy. And as I do all this, I have to consider what to do about those low bass notes, which perhaps sound like distant gongs. I want to make sure that the sustain of the chords is still audible over the bass notes. So one option is to play the chord and then gently play the bass note within the resonance of the sustain of the chord. At other times, the bass note, I think, could be more dramatic and interrupt that sustain. At other times it can be very warm. Distinct in colour from the other notes. Now as we come away from the climax, there's a wonderful moment where Bach introduces the foreign note pitch, B flat. And it's as though the lighting of the piece completely changes. Now this movement is on the third string, accompanied by movement on the fourth string, against a stationary C, so as you can hear, I'm now bringing out the inner strings at the expense of the top voice. And then later on, the last part of the piece, we go from G Mixolydian to G major, or G Ionian. And Brouwer makes sure that we really enjoy this change by making the F sharp clash against G. I'm trying to play these last lines with the voices more or less balanced, but with special care that this clash is plainly audible. Now there are many other ways to approach voicing in this piece, but I hope that the principle is clear. It's about being able to achieve any balance you want, and then simply choosing what it is you want to hear in a given moment. In chordal textures especially, there are often a lot of interesting dissonances to hear. And even when I'm thinking about equal voicing, I may have a bias towards those dissonant elements, as in this chord in the Brouwer. In this phrase, from Bach's Chaconne, we see Bach writing in such a way that apart from the beginning of the phrase and the end of the phrase, where we have consonant D major chords, all of the chords in between have a dissonance somewhere, some restless element. So I want all of the voices to be vibrating against one another, but to make life easier for myself, perhaps I'll focus on the notes that are dissonant and the notes that they're most dissonant with, which is typically notes a step or a seventh away. So I'm listening for things like suspensions or sevenths in the chords, but then listening for what they're dissonant with. For example, in this chord, there's a seventh here. It's particularly dissonant with the A, so I'll get that sounding clear and then arrange the other notes around that sound. Now, when we're thinking about voicing, one of the things that often comes up is the way the thumb moves against the fingers. One problem that comes up quite frequently is the thumb being too heavy. So, for example, that Brouwer study often sounds like this. With the fourth string dominating a little too much. But equally common is where the thumb doesn't adequately oppose the movement of the fingers, so that chords seem to lack a proper bass sonority, so we get an effect rather like this, instead of. We really want to hear this sound underpinning that sound. We don't want to sound like a pianist playing with both hands, and yet the left hand is weaker than the right, unless, again, a specific voicing is being applied. Now, in some situations, you can even try to make the upper notes of the chord sound like resonances of the bass, so to speak. Supposing I take that G minor chord, get my G full, and then just gently add the top notes. That is quite a useful voicing of chords that I often use. An example would be the first section of Britten's Nocturnal, Musingly. That first section starts with a meandering single line, and the very first time we hear a chord, it's this E major, followed by this A major. And the dynamic is very quiet. And here I think it can be helpful to play the low E more strongly than the notation implies. So I want to avoid this. Where the B is too much. And the E isn't really doing the work it's supposed to do. So I'm going to do the opposite, play the E more strongly, but with the flesh of the thumb, so that it isn't too harsh. And the upper notes, soft enough to sound almost like upper harmonics, part of the colour of that low E. Here's a famous study by Fernando Sor, number 2 in Segovia's classic collection. This is a typical classical texture, a cantilena with a bubbling accompaniment in the middle voices. It might remind us that Sor was sought after not just as a guitar teacher, but as a singing teacher as well. Now, one obvious possibility that I think we should explore is playing the melody stronger than the accompaniment. Those bubbling sixteenths in particular will want to be well below the level of the melody, with the bass perhaps varying in strength depending on how active it is. What might be surprising is how much separation I think can be helpful. Let's suppose I want this piece to start softly. Then I can put that softness into the accompaniment and let the melody ring out rather strongly, perhaps. A fairly extreme separation between melody and accompaniment is something you'll hear very often in piano recitals. And I suppose any voice recital where a voice is accompanied by a piano. I recall attending a masterclass with the pianist Murray Pariah, in which the student was bringing out a melody perfectly clearly, and yet Pariah asked for the melody to be played yet more strongly, even though the music was supposed to be soft. The comparison he made was, well, when you're accompanying a singer, the singer stands in front of the piano to sing. And so you want to put the melody there, in front of everything else. Now, one of the things I like about this approach, with a lot of separation between melody and accompaniment, is what it does for the guitar's sustain. The piano and the guitar have this in common, that as soon as we sound a note, the note starts to die away. This means that the start of the note, which on the guitar has a very distinctive plucked sound, can easily dominate. So when you're playing this accompaniment, even with the most beautiful tone production, there's some element of pluck, 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 pluck. And so as the note is ringing in the melody, there are these plucking sounds interacting with the sustaining sound, which is very rapidly dying, of the melody note. Now in this saw piece, if the accompaniment is soft enough, you can actually follow the sustain of the melody notes because the accompanimental notes with their plucked attack are not in any way drowning out the sustain of the melody note. You can actually hear the envelope of its sustain. Now, one of the pleasures of this texture is that with the accompaniment played so softly, in a way you notice the sustain all the more, and this makes the melody more singing in quality. When you play in this way, you leave open another interesting textural option, which is to use the accompaniment actively to amplify the ebb and flow of the melody. For example, in the first phrase, I'm growing towards measure 3 and then away. Growing. let's hear how it sounds if the accompaniment does this along with the melody, encouraging it in its search. This too is a fine way to play. For this study, I like to mix the two approaches. The first time the melody is heard, the harmonization is very placid, unfolding over a tonic pedal. But in the reprise, saw reharmonizes it, putting that surprising diminished seventh chord. So what if the first time I play with a melody very separate from the accompaniment? Then in the reprise I can use the accompaniment to reinforce the diminished seventh, drawing attention to it with this change in voicing. Now, getting this kind of separation can be challenging with the bass. Here's a study by Aguado that I'm fond of giving to my students as a challenge. When you first try to achieve a floating melody, the main challenge you face is that whenever you try to bring out one digit, the others want to do the same. So when we play the Aguado study just mentioned, the whole chord tends to spike each time the thumb plays, and we get an effect a bit like this. Right, where the fingers get strong every time the thumb plays. So before tackling this study, it's a good idea to work on developing a singing and expressive sound in the thumb on its own. Here's a source study that's good for that. Notice how the accompaniment in the fingers can be played much more quietly than the melody. And then later on in the piece they acquire sometimes more importance and the balance can be adjusted. In some textures, the voices participate in a conversation through techniques such as imitation and voice exchange. Here's the beginning of the Lure from Bach's E major lute suite. We see that the top voice enters on its own, presenting a memorable idea. The lower voice comes in with the same idea, as though conversing with the upper voice. I would say that for this effect to be enjoyed to the full, the lower voice could come in a bit louder than the top voice. You're encouraging the listener's ear to shift its focus. When dealing with these changes of focus, I follow a rule that the bass needs more help than the soprano, and the middle voice needs more help than either. Because people are not necessarily listening down to the bass for melodic interest, and even less into an inner voice. Take this example from a set of variations by Narvaez. This is a very contrapuntal texture. The notes in red mark the point where Narvaez introduces a Marian hymn called O Gloriosa Domina. I've added an extra staff so that you can see it on its own, and I've even put the Latin text in there. Now, the way Narvaez builds up to this entry is quite marvellous. There's a series of overlapping entries with the first few notes of the hymn, marked here in blue. After all of these false entries, the entrance of the hymn for real in the red notes should be quite magical, but unfortunately it's rather hard to bring it out. But if we don't mark it, the listener is unlikely to notice it. One possible approach is to set up a rather hushed dynamic just before the entry of the chant, and then to bring out the middle voice, perhaps even more than any of the other entries. It's this constant shifting of balances that I think can be particularly effective in contrapuntal pieces. Take this example, Sohr's famous study in C, number 1 from Segovia's collection. Here's a piece to remind us that Sohr received his earliest musical training at a school for choristers. In it, we see that just as with the Brouwer study, every voice is beautifully written, as though to be sung. This suggests that we could aim for a perfect equality of voices at all times. And indeed, that's what I would try to master first in playing this study. But what I miss in this approach is that sense of interplay among the voices, especially because sometimes they're more independent and at other times they come together more as chords, usually to make a cadence. So I encourage my students to frequently change the balance of voices, so that the listener can enter into the fascination of Sohr's contrapuntal writing. In doing this, no two performances need be the same. Let's look at some of the options. let's talk about how to develop these voicing tools. Now, one of my teachers used to say, counterpoint begins with a single line. So the first step is to hear the individual voices, and to hear them with musical meaning. So let's suppose I'm learning the Brouwer chorale study. I'll start by playing and singing the individual voices. A particularly valuable test, once you've mastered that, is to play the study omitting one of the voices on the guitar, but then supplying it with your voice. So supposing I play the beginning of the Brouwer without the middle voice. And now I'm going to sing that middle voice. That really helps me ensure that I know what it is I'm listening for when I actually play the chords, because I'm very familiar with that pitch that I'm checking for by ear. Just this one exercise wakes up the ears like nothing else, and I find that once my listening is sharpened, then the fingers start to follow. But sometimes I encourage that process by taking the voice that I'm singing and lightly tapping the string with the finger that's supposed to play the voice, while continuing to play the other voices normally. So here's the Brouwer without the middle voice. So I'm not playing the third string, but now I'm going to tap the third string. And sing what it is I'm tapping. And I'm fingering with the left hand the voice that I'm not plucking all the way with the right hand. So it's as though I'm analysing or breaking down the movements of the right hand, separating out one of the voices by doing something different with the finger there, all the time keeping my ears trained with the singing. This leads, I think, quite naturally to the crucial skill, which is to be able to control the amount of pressure a finger gives to the string individually. First, we want to balance the notes of a chord. So, coming back to that exercise of checking the sustain of each note in turn. I think if you practice this exercise a lot, you'll discover how to refine the contact in each finger and the amount of energy you put into the stroke. Now we want to learn how to bring out any particular note. To do that, we have to give extra pressure in one finger and take away some of the usual pressure from the others. So we pick the string we want to bring out. Let's say it's the top string that I'm going to play with my ring finger, and the chord is so I'm going to get underneath that string with a firm tip joint. I sometimes call this kind of stroke the scoop. The other fingers play more on top of the string, as though skimming. So I have a scoop and the A finger, and the skim with the other fingers. As I play like that, I experience the difference, particularly in the tip joints of my fingers. Now you can make up your own exercises by developing melodic motion within block chords. All of this is at the service of the music and your imagination. What we're trying to cultivate is an approach to guitar playing where you're always choosing a balance of voices. Once you've cultivated that, I think you'll find that even a neutral texture, more or less what you were doing before you cultivated these skills, somehow sounds much more focused than it did before. And I think you'll enjoy what it does for the beauty of your tone production. Thank you.